Waminjaka, Ganokandana Koki. I'd like to acknowledge the lands on which I am gathered as those of the Wurundjeri people. I'd like to acknowledge the traditions that go back beyond humans, the amazing creation of this place, of Birrarung coming out of the mountains, the amazing forests and that journey to the sea. I'd like to acknowledge country first and foremost. I'd like to acknowledge the Aboriginal people and their thousands of generations on this country, and to acknowledge the disruptions of the colonial invasion. But we move on. I'd like to acknowledge all of you as part of this ongoing story of country, and to acknowledge in particular my granddaughter, her grandchildren, and her great-great-great-grandchildren, that they have something of country to put their feet into, but also one to tell their stories, Waminjaka. Thanks, Andreas. It's a pleasure to be here with everybody. And it is a long time, technically, since I've been back here. I'm, yes, a teacher at ACU, but I also teach bioethics and evidence-based research along with the Indigenous unit. But I'm a researcher at the Australian National University, and I am researching how humans relate to country. And I'm doing that first and foremost through the colonial invasion. It was very interesting when my supervisor said to me, "Oh, Janet, I think it's time you started to look at Melbourne." I burst out laughing and said, "Oh, there's nothing to tell. We don't tell the story of Melbourne." And we don't. We don't tell the history of Melbourne because it's awful. Right from 1803, when the surveyors came around, the one good thing that came out of that was, of course, their search for fresh water, which led them to, of course, what they called the Yarra River. But was there an analysis that this country was well inhabited by Aboriginal people? They could see the campfires at night, but there were forays and incursions and moments of shootings and that got them to that place. And of course, they did eventually come to the Yarra, where they christened it a place for a village. But before they did that, they planted crops on what we now call Churchill Island. So this was an invasion that was already well planned. This had nothing to do with engaging country as it was. This was about imposing on country a whole nother interpretation of what it was to live in a landscape. And that started right back, of course, in 1788, going through to the 1790s and the massacre of seals and whales, to the extreme that those populations of creatures were wiped out within 2 decades. So I take it very serious the way the colonists invaded, but how they also interpreted country. Batman came, and of course Batman immediately bought his sheep, had a treaty signed, which was immediately rejected, but also garnished 600,000 acres of land in perpetuity for him and his family. Again, this interpretation of country that is something to be possessed, that belonged to only certain people, is very much the story of the colonial invasion, both of the whole country, but in particular Melbourne. Because after Batman arrived, what we had was one of the biggest land grabs ever. The theft of 20 million hectares of land right across Victoria into South Australia, up through northern Western New South Wales into southern Queensland. That happened in a decade. That land has never been paid for, nor has it ever been acknowledged that that was theft. And of course, we then have the story of the city itself, and that's where my analysis starts, in what happened in the city itself. How the land was totally transformed, the river was completely transformed to make it into a European channel, so it served the economy that was developing. This had nothing to do with living on country as it was, or hearing its stories, or even engaging it in the way that it had been created over millennia. This was about an economy based on a land grab, and then, of course, based on what we call the extractive industries. The annihilation of creatures, the annihilation of forests, and the annihilation, technically, of the original inhabitants. And that still continues. My thesis says very clearly that the colonial invasion is ongoing. And I take the words of Edward Wilson very seriously when he says, "We have destroyed the biosphere. We're like a chimera, a two-headed monster. We have intelligence, but we still operate out of base emotions. And we still don't understand the very fact that we are destroying the very thing that gives us life." And those words ring really true when you look back at the colonial invasion of Melbourne. And it was an invasion. There was nothing pretty or polite about it. The only thing I'm ever grateful for is that the Riviera or Birrarung tricked them consistently. Massive floods that every time they built their industries up along where Spencer Street or Southern Cross Station is, along would come the floods and wash them all away. In fact, some of the biggest floods happened from the 1830s into the 1840s and 50s. And then, of course, they brought in James Coode in the 1885 and transformed the river into an English channel. So she would obey her lords and masters, the colonists. And of course, then they began to dam back up through the hills. Yan Yean was first, and then I think there are about 13 dams that hold the river back. Now, that's an interesting story. It's an interesting start because it's going to be an indication of where this city may end up. Well, maybe the crisis will be with our water supplies. Our rainfall depleting, less snow melts, and holding the river back, we are beginning to already see that our water may be our nemesis. But the other side of my investigation is looking at pre-colonial times, which is also very complex because we have very few original records about how Aboriginal people actually engaged country. What was their relationship? How do we define that relationship? And one of the themes I'm looking at is that country and Birrarung, because after all it is Birrarung's country, saw country as an ancestor, as a living member of their whole tribal connections, was that country itself was an ancestor and that they had obligations and responsibilities to sustaining and working and being part of country symbiotically. So in looking at those two sides of human relationality to country, I'm also doing it through art. And it's interesting, when I painted the city of Melbourne as she is now and looked at where the marshlands, these amazing marshlands right down through the river delta, right up through the northern banks, right down through even those marshlands that go down through Elwood, right down through into Pakenham, right back into Healesville, what we call the Great Marul, where I live in the Yarra Valley, right through to Healesville and down into Launching Place. We're aware that we have destroyed something of an incredible value. The Gary Presslin writes very clearly about the destructions of those marshlands has removed something that could have been equal to Kakadu. The amount of vegetation, amphibian life, bird life, the trees, the islands out into Port Phillip Bay, and the reduction of all of those, along with the Yarra Valley, which now still sits on amazing cisterns, which on amazing drainage that pull the water out of the valley to make sure she stays dry for all the farms and the vineyards, is that we've lost something, and maybe we've lost it forever. So as much as it's a story of challenge and a story of, because I have been challenged, that look what we've got, look what the city of Melbourne has got in relationship to where it sits, where it's been formed and how it's been shaped. But look at all the wondrous things it's brought. I'm just going to leave that as an open question, because I don't know what it means when we create cities like this and we destroy the very essence of the earth itself. That, for me, is a bigger concern. Because if cities like this, made of concrete and asphalt, have taken the life out of the biosphere, and just multiply that around the world, and my question remains, how is it that we humans relate to country? There is no ideal place, because all of us, including all creatures, engage country and change it. But how is it for the future, or whatever that future might be, are we going to continue to engage this country, impact it, change it, and what are the legacies that we're going to leave when there's very little left of country now that in its original forms, and our native creatures are being massacred out of annihilated, which I think is the biggest story, is how we treat our native creatures, without any consideration that the anthropomorphisation of this city, the human base of creating a city that's only for humans, that has no place for snakes and lizards and koalas and kangaroos, and that technically we see them all as pests because they consistently engage our gardens. How is it that we are going to engage country from today onwards? It's a question I'll leave you with. Wominjaka. Thank you.